At the time that I'm hopefully releasing this video, we are exactly 1 week away from the release of Monster Hunter Wilds and the beginning of the 6th generation of Monster Hunter. It's a time for cheers and celebration for Monster Hunters all over the world as they get ready to trade in their Clutch Claws and Palamutes for Focus Modes and Sacreds. But at the same time, it's also a time for a little sadness. While we usher in the 6th generation, we have to say goodbye to the 5th. And while it's true that Monster Hunter World and Monster Hunter Rise aren't going away and people can always go back and play those games whenever they want to, it's also true that Capcom doesn't tend to look back on previous generations of Monster Hunter, with the only games still having access to official online being Monster Hunter World, Monster Hunter Rise, and Generations Ultimate. So today I want to celebrate and slightly eulogize the Monster Hunter game that I have by far put the most amount of hours into in the entire series, even though I've been playing since back on the PSP days. Today I'm going to talk about my favorite monsters and mechanics from Monster Hunter Rise and its Master Rank expansion Sunbreak, as well as take a look at some of the swings Capcom took mechanically that didn't quite land. And so, as we get ready to prepare to depart for the wilds, let's take one last look at a game with high highs, low lows, and all in all, some very cool monsters. I'm Grayson the Bard, and thank you for joining me as I bid a fond farewell to Monster Hunter Rise. I suppose the best place for us to start is the monsters, and I strongly believe that Monster Hunter Rise has one of the best monster lineups in the entire series. And while I still put Monster Hunter 3U and 4U a little bit above it, since a majority of my top 5 and top 10 monsters come from those games, I still think Rise is a strong third place. It has a great variety of creature designs ranging from bandit leader weasel raptors and fruit-throwing prankster monkeys to Oni mask-wearing ice bears and samurai tigers. Capcom really pushed the envelope when it came to Rise's creature design, and while definitely not for everyone, it was absolutely a hit for me. And these are just Rise's original monsters that I'm talking about, not even taking into consideration all of the fan-favorite monsters that Capcom brought back after, for some of them, multiple games of absence. Monsters like Mizutsune, Astalos, and Arzuros. But for me, the best thing about Rise's monster is the sheer variety of creatures. I'm pretty sure that every creature type in the Monster Hunter franchise is represented with at least one monster in Monster Hunter Rise. Naturally, there is more of a bias towards flying and bird wyverns, since those types of wyverns make up a majority of the creatures in the Monster Hunter franchise, but especially after World's admittedly kinda samey roster with not much variety in Monster Skeleton until you got to Iceborne and some of the endgame Elder Dragons, I am happy to see more variants throughout the entirety of the game. Although the fact that Giratodus was the only representation for Piscean Wyverns in the game was not a great choice. I am a Piscean Wyvern defender, and I am really looking forward to the day when they get some respect. Now, this is definitely not me saying that the entire roster is sunshine and rainbows, because there's definitely a few monsters that I don't personally connect with. The big one, unfortunately, being the flagship. I really like Magnamalo's fight and the mechanics surrounding it, but I feel like its design is a bit too much, even by Monster Hunter standards, and its role in Rise's story is, to say the very least, underwhelming compared to the previous game's flagship monsters. This is 100% a Atomic Bomb versus Coughing Baby comparison, but think about the presence that monsters like Gormagala and Lagiacrus, and to a lesser extent Nergigante, had in their respective games. And then compare that to Magnamalo, who shows up in, I think, 2 cutscenes, then you fight it, and then it vanishes into irrelevance throughout the rest of the game until the very end of the All-Mother Narwa fight, where it pops up for seemingly no reason. But that is really the worst example of Rise's roster, where you also have monsters like Ghost Harag and Tetranodon, who I think are 2 of the best new monsters to grace the franchise in recent memory. In my opinion, blowing any of World's original non-Elder Dragon monsters completely out of the water. Ghost Harag especially is an absolute powerhouse and made a huge impression both on myself and on the community as a whole. It is an incredibly popular monster, and it is very rare as well to see an ice-based monster be a brute force physical powerhouse, rather than relying on more like elegant moves and projectile attacks. But Ghost Harag manages to balance the edge of fast, aggressive physical attacker and using a traditionally more elegant element perfectly. It uses ice mostly to augment its own strength. I mean, what's not to like when you see a bear breathing ice onto its arms and then emerging with a giant, cleaver of an ice sword in place of its hand? It is an amazing spectacle. And I will admit, when I first saw Ghost Harag in one of the Rise trailers, I was underwhelmed. I was like, yeah, it's like a big bear with a weird mask, and I guess that's it. I did not have high expectations for it, but when I fought it for the first time, it clicked and it blew me away. And it's funny considering those initial expectations I had, because now, this Barry the Chopper looking ass bear is my most fought monster in both Rise and Sunbreak. And admittedly, a big part of that is because before Sunbreak released, I was trying to crown hunt every monster in the base game, and Ghost Harag refused to be small. I swear I spent so goddamn long just trying to get a small crown of this stupid bear. But I also just love the fight, and it frequently became my testing grounds for new builds that I was working on. When I wanted to see how a set would fare against an actual monster instead of just the training dummy, it would be Ghost Harag who I would test it against. And then we have Tetranodon. If you have been watching my channel for a while, you'll know that the dumber the monster, the goofier it looks, the more likely I am to love it. And Tetranodon is a 100% USDA Prime certified goofus in the highest order. Not only is he stupid, he is an excellent example of what an early game monster should be. Tetranodon's fight does an awesome job of not only teaching players important mechanics they'll need for later fights in the series, but also tests what the players have already learned from the more punching bag monsters in the 1 to 2 star ranks. Tetranodon throws a lot of mechanics at the player in a convenient sumo frog platypus package, instructing hunters on how to deal with water blight, stuns, wire falling out of pin moves, and for shield weapons like lance and gunlance, dealing with moves that you can't fully block. It's designed to be a decently challenging early game threat to really test what you know from the initial easy breezy monsters into the slightly more challenging but still lower rank monsters. And I think Tetranodon fills that role perfectly. Aside from Acnosom, it was the monster that I feel like I had the hardest time with when I first played Rise. Despite both these monsters having clear yokai inspiration, Oni for Ghost Harag and a Kappa for Tetranodon, they're both monsters I could easily see fitting into different settings for future Monster Hunter games. And while I won't be talking about all of the yokai monsters, I feel the same way about most of the other original Rise monster designs. And while Sunbreak didn't have as many fully original monsters, it did add a monster who very quickly cracked into my personal top 5. And since I'm celebrating my favorite things about this game, I can't stop talking about the roster without mentioning the man, the myth, the legend, Garangolm. I love Garangolm. In my eyes, he is a perfect monster who can do no wrong. Until Garangolm, we had never, at least to my knowledge, we had never seen a large monster using the primate skeleton that was actually large. Rajang's pretty big, Blangonga's pretty big, but they both don't tower over the hunters like Garangolm does. And what makes it even better is the fact that based on the little bits of lore that we get from it, Garangolm is generally a pretty peaceful monster, content to live out its days lounging peacefully in the forest and encouraging plant growth using the sap from its body. It's only when its territory is invaded or it feels threatened that we see anything similar to the other 8 monsters who share a skeleton with it. It is the perfect gentle giant who you don't want to mess with. In terms of design, it's based off of Frankenstein's monster, as well as more general fantasy depictions of golem-like creatures, all mixed with a gorilla-like face and body structure. It is a great mix of fantastical and over-the-top, while still feeling grounded in the world of Monster Hunter. Garangolm feels like a creature who you could see walking around even with the more pronounced fantasy elements, which is something that I absolutely love, and monsters like that make for my favorite creature designs. And in my opinion, Garangolm does the best job of straddling the line between a action RPG boss and a living, breathing animal. It's incredibly easy for monsters in Monster Hunter, especially more recent designs, to kind of push into one direction or the other, either being a very over-the-top anime-esque RPG villain or just a big creature. And I feel like Garangolm lives very comfortably in the center of that Venn diagram. And the fight itself is hands down my favorite fight in Monster Hunter Rise, even if it is the weakest on paper of the Sunbreak monster trio of Garangolm, Lunagaron, and Malzeno. At its core, Garangolm is a physical powerhouse, which is the type of monster that I enjoy fighting the most. Elemental beams and fireballs are great, but nothing is more fun to me than a monster that'll just run up to you and punch you in the face. And when Garangolm does use elements, he doesn't just add a water breath attack or throw a fireball at you. Instead, he works the elements into its physical attacks using the sap on its arms. I especially love when it uses its elemental abilities to propel itself across the map and crash into you like an angry simian comet. But my personal favorite move, the absolute best move that Garangolm has at its disposal, is its pin attack. It will launch the hunter into the air and attempt to clap, smashing the hunter like a little fly. And my favorite part of it, the thing that sends it over the top for me, is the fact that when the clap happens, it sets off a burst of steam from the fire and water hand, or the fire and blast hand and the water hand colliding with each other, sending a burst of steam into the air. It is so good. Of all of the monsters in both Rise and Sunbreak, Garangolm is the monster that I want to see again the most. Especially with its ecology of promoting plant growth in its territory, with the increased importance that the mainline Monster Hunter games are putting on creating living, breathing ecosystems. I think Garangolm will fit right in. It would be great to see it moving around and having the plants around it growing bigger, becoming more difficult terrain for the hunter to have to deal with. But mostly, it's just selfish because I want to see my little boy again. Now, my goal for this video isn't to be a full multi-hour retrospective on the entire game, going through each and every monster. More of a celebration of the parts of the game that I love and talking about the parts that I'm not so big on. And so I'm probably going to stop talking about the monster roster here, even though I could, in theory, go on for hours about all the different monsters. But Tetranodon, Gosharag, and Garangolm are definitely the monsters that made the biggest impression on me in all my time with Rise. So, now I'm going to move on to what is probably the most controversial part of Monster Hunter Rise, the very experimental mechanics that Capcom introduced in it. Unlike the monster roster of Rise, it is very hard to universally sing the praises of Rise's mechanics. For one thing, it does right. There's another swing Capcom took that fell flat for me, and while I personally think that the good outweighs the bad, I can definitely understand why Rise would be someone's least favorite Monster Hunter. The swings they took were big, and the problem with big swings is that while it can set you up for massive success, it can just as often set you up for an equally massive failure. I'm going to do a bit of a compliment sandwich in this section of the video and alternate between talking about mechanics that I like and mechanics that I would be happy to never see again, starting of course with Palamutes. I watched the first reveal trailer for Monster Hunter Rise while I was driving to work, due to the Nintendo Direct it was announced at lining up perfectly with my commute time. This was a bad idea. I shouldn't have done this for a lot of reasons, but the biggest one being that the first time I saw the Palamute in the trailer, I about crashed my car into the ditch. I was so excited to have a dog in Monster Hunter. Learn from my mistakes, kids. Don't Monster Hunter and drive. With the inclusion of the new massive open worlds, giving hunters a convenient and easy way to traverse those massive open worlds was a great idea. And I love the fact that they chose to add a canine companion to the cat-based Palicos, rather than just making some kind of weird cat chariot that you rode around. Although, now that I'm saying that out loud, this was not part of my script that I wrote. I am just realizing right now that a cat chariot would actually be pretty sick if they decide to do that again in a Monster Hunter game and leave Palamutes on the wayside. I wouldn't be happy, but I would take it for a cat chariot. I also love how the Palicos and Palamutes have their own specific in-quest niches in Monster Hunter Rise, with Palicos being much more useful in combat with all of the different support skills they can use, whereas Palamutes are more useful in traversal, and the combat utility they provide is a lot more defensive and support-based. Although I will say, one of the biggest things that I was upset that they patched in Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak was at launch, the two Palicos with paralysis weapons could absolutely lock down monsters, and that was so fun and so satisfying. You felt unstoppable. And then they nerfed it, and status dogs were less good, which is sad. I get why they did it, still wish they hadn't. And then, in general, I'm just more of a dog person than a cat person. I like cats, I have a lot of friends who have cats, but I have had a dog my entire life, so being able to run around with a canine companion rather than the perpetually evergreen Palico was really fun. And in the first few trailers that I saw of Monster Hunter Wilds before I went spoiler-free in order to preserve as many surprises as I could for when I play the game next Friday, I was initially very disappointed to see that Palamutes weren't making a comeback, and instead we were getting an entirely new mount in the Sacred. Now, Sacred seems really cool, it seems incredibly fun, but it's no dog. I really hope that Palamutes make their way back into the series in one form or another, because I don't want them going the same way as Cha-Cha and Kayamba from Monster Hunter 3U. Capcom has a unfortunate tendency to introduce new types of companions for the hunter, and then have them sit by the wayside forever and never come back. I am happy to keep the Palico evergreen. It is a very core part of Monster Hunter's brand identity. But let us have a little variety. Let us have Shakalaka companions again. Let us have Palamutes. Give us all three. One of the last things I saw before I went spoiler-free on Monster Hunter Wilds was in the release date trailer back in September. There are these little otter guys that I really hope they act as potential temporary hunting companions, because I loved those little freaks when I saw them. I have been thinking about those little freaks very frequently throughout my spoiler-free journey, in part because they were one of the last things I saw, and in part because they're just great little freaks. I've probably got some footage of them up on the screen right now. Look at them. Look at them. Next up, gotta talk about Spiribirds. There is an unfortunate trend in recent Monster Hunter games to tighten up or outright remove some of the more time-consuming pre-hunt preparation aspects of Monster Hunter. We don't need to worry about planning our inventory before a hunt, or even inventory management in a fight, because you can restock items and have full access to your inventory at any of your camps out in the field. You don't even necessarily need to worry about tracking down a monster in order to fight it, because at the start of the hunt, every large monster on the map is marked for you, and you can see where it is at all times. It takes away a lot of the preparation and exploration from Monster Hunter that for a very long time was integral to its core identity. It's a decision that I'm not a fan of, and I'm curious to see how they handle it in Monster Hunter Wilds, because I really didn't like how they handled it in Rise. And the biggest, most egregious example of that is the Spiribirds. These little bastards are littered all around the map, and when you move close to them, they provide you with a small permanent buff that lasts for the entire hunt. They can buff your health, your defense, your attack, or your stamina. And they're meant to replace that traditional pre-hunt preparation, encouraging you to explore the map, collect these buffs, as well as other endemic life that they are usually around, which you can use as hunter tools to help support your hunt. On paper, this is a fine idea, and I like it how it sounds, but I do not like it in practice. In fact, I can't think of a single person who has played Rise who likes the Spiribird mechanic. Thankfully, Spiribirds aren't required for a majority of the game's content, and almost all of it can be completed without having to worry about them or their buffs. And the encounters where the buffs really matter usually have a rainbow bird at the start of the hunt to provide you with the full gamut of Spiribird buffs. But that just raises the question of why even include Spiribirds at all if you could just as easily start the hunt with all of the buffs active. I don't play on PC much, but I'm pretty sure there are a bunch of mods that just have it so that you don't need to collect Spiribirds and you start with the full amount of buffs and can get right into the hunt. I understand that they wanted to encourage players to explore more, but the way that they went about it with the birds feels tacked on and doesn't do a good job of making the exploration fun. Some of the endemic life that you can go around and collect, the marionette and puppet spiders, as well as the elemental beetles that provide status effects on the monsters when you use them, feel like more than enough to incentivize players to explore the map to collect some of those before they go to the fight itself. By forcing the players to explore by having their health and stamina and attack and defense capped until they find these little birds throughout the arena, actually does the opposite. It doesn't encourage the players to explore, it makes the exploration boring. I think Capcom took a swing with trying to encourage us to get around these big open areas, and it definitely feels like the biggest misstep in Monster Hunter Rise. But what doesn't feel like a misstep are switch skills. Monster Hunter Rise is not the first game to experiment with varying move styles for different weapons. Both Monster Hunter Frontier and Monster Hunter Generations included different hunting styles that let you switch up how you played, giving you different moves, different attacks, different ways to actually move around the arena. But Monster Hunter Rise took that a step further and actually let you swap out different moves, individual moves in your moveset, to really mix and match how you wanted to play to best suit your playstyle. Some of these switch skills would significantly change the way that you play your weapons, with the biggest examples that I can think of from weapons I played being the Storm Surge Slash from the Greatsword, which traded the Greatsword's traditional slow charge combo for a series of quick but still relatively hard-hitting hits that opened up elemental and status playstyles to a weapon that traditionally discouraged it just because of how slow the weapon attacked. Or the Silkbind Sakura Slash, which traded the Helm Splitter move on the longsword for a multi-hit round slash that built up your spear gauge, meaning each time you used it, the damage got higher and higher. Sakura Slash was actually the only way that I ended up playing longsword in Rise, because I don't like counters and parries. I'm not good at them, I don't find them fun. If you do, cool. But I miss the old longsword playstyle from pre-5th gen, and playing Rise with the Sakura Slash is the closest I've felt to that playstyle since Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate. Now, the biggest downside of switch skills is that just like with any game with modularity and customization in its movesets, there's always going to be a best option that lets you deal the most damage and end hunts the fastest. Those options are always going to be prioritized by the community because they are the most optimal. And the more unique but less powerful options run the risk of being forgotten. If you've been around the channel for a long time, then you'll know that some of my first videos on here were niche off-meta builds for Sunbreak because I wanted to encourage people to play around with the switch skills and armor skills that weren't necessarily optimal. Again, I am spoiler-free on a lot of Monster Hunter Wilds, so I don't know for sure what the weapon or skill system is going to look like, but I know I want to bring that type of content back at some point, switch skills or no. And it was actually the switch skill and the weapon augmenting system that encouraged me to start making Monster Hunter content in the first place. If it weren't for switch skills, and if it weren't for those weird niche ways of playing weapons becoming possible through them, I wouldn't be making content today. And so I gotta thank switch skills for that, at the very least. I also want to mention that I was not the biggest fan of the switch skill swap scroll in Sunbreak, because it took something that I loved about the system, the modularity and being able to pick and choose different moves and figuring out a potentially unique playstyle by mixing and matching different aspects of the weapon into a system where you could have everything. I much prefer the original system because it gives you constraints, and it makes the feeling of pushing past those constraints and breaking into something unique and fun that much more exciting. Whereas with the red scroll and blue scroll option in Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak, you don't really have to choose. You can have the best of every world without having too much of a trade-off. I was not a fan. Next up, I'm going to talk about one more mechanic that I really enjoyed in Sunbreak specifically, and that was the follower quest system. Until recently, I had never played Monster Hunter Frontier, so I never had any experience with NPC hunters in the quests until Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. So when I found out they were incorporating NPC hunters into single-player experiences, I was ecstatic. I thought that was awesome. I got a lot of friends into the Monster Hunter series through Monster Hunter Rise, but prior to that, I had only a handful of people who I consistently played with. And if they weren't available, or if I was just getting in a couple hunts before work, or, in the wee hours of morning when I woke up and couldn't fall back asleep, I loved having the ability to go in and do hunts with some NPC hunters. And the way that you unlocked them by helping them out with their quests, and then eventually you were able to bring them into, any quest that you wanted, pretty much, felt like you were actually building up trust with those companions and felt really natural in the world of Monster Hunter. I know they're bringing back NPC hunters for Monster Hunter Wilds, and I hope they do something similar, where you don't have access to everybody at the start. You have to, do things for them, progress quests with them in order to unlock who you want. even though I 100% just used Hinoa and Luchika the entire time because they're my boys and they absolutely melted any monster I pointed them at. I would like to see them maybe have a little bit more damage, because I remember very early on in Sunbreak's life cycle, someone crunched the numbers and found out that they were only doing like a very, very minuscule amount of damage, and a majority of their utility came from the ability to KO monsters and to heal the hunter. I loved how in Monster Hunter Frontier, when I was playing it for a different video series I've been doing, I loved how the NPC hunters felt substantial. They felt like they were also a threat to the monster, not just you, with them being there to support. In addition, I love how the NPC hunters take a little bit of the heat off of the hunter. Any additional companion you have makes the game infinitely easier because the monster is targeting you less, but I don't mind that. I am not a Monster Hunter content creator who talks much about difficulty because difficulty is subjective. People play games for fun. Some people like the challenge, some people like taking a walk in the park. You do you, baby. You're never going to hear me complaining about difficulty in a Monster Hunter game because I'll be honest, I just don't care. But what you will hear me complaining about is the final mechanic I'm going to talk about today, and that is Rampage. I don't much care for Rampage, but I also don't have the same animosity that a lot of people in the community have for it. I think it is a neat idea on paper that was executed pretty poorly. Capcom took a gamble on a tower defense mode, it didn't land, and when Sunbreak came around, they got rid of it completely. A lot like Spiribirds, I actually like the idea of Rampage on paper, and the concept sounds like a lot of fun. A fast-paced tower defense mode where you use siege equipment to hold back a horde of rampaging monsters, before finally fighting off a powerful, beefed-up version of a regular monster at the end. It's the execution that really feels lacking, particularly the fact that Rampages feel incredibly disconnected from the core identity of Monster Hunter. Mowing through hordes of monsters is something you'd expect to do in a Dynasty Warriors or a Devil May Cry game, but the biggest, most defining feature of Monster Hunter has always been its methodical one-on-one-ish fights against big, powerful creatures, and putting all of those creatures in a horde and letting the player mow through them like a lawnmower on a particularly dry day just minimizes the cool factor of a lot of the monsters, as well as the sense of accomplishment that taking them down outside of a rampage gives. When you can blast through 6 Raknakadakis in a row using a cannon, where does the fun come from going mano a mano with one with a giant saxophone? As a positive, I will say that Rampages are a lot of fun in multiplayer, especially in the early days of Rise when they were still new and fresh. I remember back when I was playing through Rise for the first time with friends, and we would get to points where we needed to do Rampages, and we would 100% save them until we needed to, until we could do them together, until we could play them multiplayer. Because I do think Rampages lend themselves much better to multiplayer play than they do to story mode play, to solo play. There is a lot of fun to be had with the chaos of rampaging monsters and being able to really prepare with your party members, figuring out, all right, who's going to be on this specific siege weapon, who's going to be in charge of taking down the tank monsters to make sure they don't bust through the gate, who is going to keep monsters on lockdown, who's going to be doing damage, who gets to fire the big nuclear cannon at the end of the quest and leave the monster in a smoldering mess of napalm. I love that thing. It's cool as hell. I wish it was in quests other than Rampages. But after a while, the game mode definitely lost its luster, and especially in solo play, it is just a slog to get through. And I ended up avoiding it like the plague whenever I could. I remember the collective cheer in the community when they announced that there would be no required Rampages in Monster Hunter Rise Sunbreak. So I think it's safe to say that Capcom learned their lesson on that one, and we won't be seeing it again. Like I said, I'm going to wrap up my talks on Rise's mechanics here because those are the main mechanical things that I think about when I think about Rise. I could talk about Curios crafting and anomaly investigations from Sunbreak since they're important to the endgame of Sunbreak, but I don't really feel any positive or negative nostalgia. I guess nostalgia is the only word I can really use, even though the game is still current. But I don't feel any positive or negative nostalgia for either of those mechanics the same way I do the other ones I talked about, and the intention of this video is not to go into detail of everything Rise has, but to point out its particular highs and lows in my opinion. And also, if you want to know what I think about the anomaly investigations and curios crafting, about 2 years ago I did a video on just that topic while Sunbreak was still coming out and current. Feel free to check that video out. I still stand by a lot of what I said in it. I watched it as I was writing this script just to make sure that I didn't say anything too far away from my current views about the system, and yeah, a lot of it still holds up. So if you want to hear me talk about those systems, check that video out. To wrap up what is, looking at my my Audacity window right now, my longest video to date, and this farewell to Monster Hunter Rise, I do want to move to a slightly more personal note. I've talked about the monsters, I've talked about the mechanics, and I want to talk about my experience with this game. 2022 was a shitty year for me. 2023 wasn't much better, and 2024 was a bit of a mixed bag, but thankfully leaning towards positive. And through all 3 of those years, Monster Hunter Rise became a comfort game for me. It was something I could look forward to after a particularly rough day at work. It was a way to connect with friends and disconnect from my own brain when it was being particularly unkind to itself. And it was also the start of my Monster Hunter content creation journey. I wouldn't be making this video today for significantly more people than I thought would ever see my content if it weren't for Monster Hunter Rise. A lot of my friends who recently got into the series got into the game through Rise, and getting to see them figure out the game and find their favorite weapons, their favorite monsters, getting to laugh with them as they fainted, getting to cheer with them as we cleared particularly hard quests. The final quest of Sunbreak, Primordial Malzeno, I fought with someone who I have been playing Monster Hunter with for a very long time, and it was amazing to be able to clear that final quest with that person. Those are memories that I will always cherish of Monster Hunter Rise. The Monster Hunter series, ever since I was a little kid, has been my favorite video game series, and it has always felt like home. And even though I still can't say that it is my favorite game in the series, Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate still holds that title. I think I'm always going to hold a very special place in my heart for Monster Hunter Rise and Sunbreak. These games mean a lot to me. I'm sure they mean a lot to a lot of people watching this video. I'm sure they don't mean as much as they mean to me to a lot of people watching this video, and that's okay. People are weird. They form emotional connections to different things. Bada bing, bada boom. But the long and short of it is, it feels kind of weird to say goodbye to this game, even though I know it's still going to be sitting on my shelf, ready to pop into my Switch at a moment's notice. It's still going to be sitting in my Steam library waiting to be re-downloaded. But at the end of the day, it's not the monsters, and it's not the mechanics that I'm going to think about when I think about Monster Hunter Rise. I'm going to think about playing with friends. I'm going to think about seeing them figure out the game. I'm going to think about the moments of triumph as we cleared endgame bosses. I'm going to think about helping people grind for armor sets that they're excited to build. I'm going to think about layered armor fashion shows we did as my friend shows off his absolutely pixel-perfect cosplay of Jim Carrey's The Mask. I'm going to think about all the time I spent playing Monster Hunter Rise, and the memories I made, and how weird it is that not even my favorite game in the series, I have the most positive nostalgia for my time playing it. I can't wait to make new memories in Monster Hunter Wilds, but I am very much going to miss Monster Hunter Rise. Thank you all so much for watching this little celebration and eulogy of Monster Hunter Rise. We are a week out from the release of Wilds, and until then, I am still finishing up a video series where I talk about a different monster each day and hunt it until the game comes out, so check those videos out if you want. Like, comment, and subscribe if you want to. Don't if you don't. And until next time, I'll see you next time.